So this week's Torah portion is taken from the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Very, very difficult book, as you know, to read and understand and try to delve because it portrays a world that's very alien to us, the world of the temple and the priests and the sacrifices. So the three main tropes that run throughout the book of Vayikra. First, of course, is the laws of sacrifice, the korbanot. The second is the laws of the kahanut, of the priesthood. And there's also a concern about ritual and spiritual purity and impurity, tuma and tohara. And this runs throughout the book. Very strange concepts for us to understand. And this week especially, and I feel for Matthew because that's his Torah portion he has to talk about tomorrow morning, this double parasha of Tazria-Metzora, which deals with this skin ailment called tzara'at. And I prefer to call it tzara'at rather than translations that have come down to us through the ages, because it's not what we think it is, it's something different. So when the Torah was translated into Greek in the Septuagint, they used the Greek word lepra. It simply means skin ailment. Some sort of skin ailment could be eczema, could be a rash. It's a strange ailment because it also appears on the walls of houses and on garments as well. So it's not only humans that are infected with this tzara'at. But the translation of lepra, which means skin ailment, is unfortunate because it's translated into English as leprosy. And you know it's not leprosy, it's not Hansen's disease, it's not this bacterial infection that people do get. It's something else because it's not a medical condition. Clearly, when you read the Torah portion, it was the priests who would diagnose this ailment, the priests would treat it, and the person would be let back into the community by word of the priests. The priests would decide, so the Kohanim would decide. So it wasn't a medical condition, it wasn't medical doctors, it was religious leaders that decided. The theme of Torah and Tuma, of ritual purity and impurity, was addressed last week's parasha already. We had some restrictions as to what could be eaten. We have the laws of kashrut, which is well known that Jews don't eat pork. The reason given for that in the Torah is simply because land animals that could be eaten had to have cleft hooves and chew their cud, and a pig doesn't chew its cud. That's a simple reason. It has cleft hooves, but it doesn't chew its cud. Fish are defined, or sea creatures that could be eaten have to have scales and fins, and birds, there's a list of birds that are allowed to be eaten. And the reason for it is because they are impure. They are a source of impurity. It doesn't mean they're dirty. It means that if someone consumes them or touches their carcass, they become impure and cannot be part of communal worship, entering the temple precincts. And similarly, this week we have this element called tzara'at, and Matthew will address that in more detail tomorrow morning. We don't know what it was, what caused it, except that we have some clues in the Torah reading. So Torah calls someone who is struck with tzara'at, that person is called a Metzora, and the Torah uses the Hebrew word nega, which means to smite. So the person was smitten with this tzara'at. So from that we understand that this was a physical manifestation of divine displeasure. The person had done something wrong, therefore God struck them with this tzara'at. And they had to be quarantined from the community. They had to be set aside from the community for a certain period of time before they could be let in. They had to go through a ritual of ritual purity, cleanliness, before they could allow back into the community and once again approach God with the sacrifice of the korbanot in the temple precincts. So the rabbis have a play on words. A person struck with tzara'at is a Metzora. And there's a phrase, motzi shem ra, which means someone who slanders, who brings out a bad name, an evil name. So the rabbis decided that a person with tzara'at was a slanderer. And so God punishes them by having the skin ailment. They have to be quarantined, set apart from the community until they repented and came back into the community. And I guess if you think about it carefully, a person who goes around slandering others does divorce themselves from the community, because people eventually don't want anything to do with that person because they know whatever they say will be slandered by that person and would affect them in the end. So they avoid the person's avoided. So perhaps that's a logical understanding of tzara'at. This whole idea of kedusha, of holiness, is very important in the book of Leviticus. The authors who wrote Leviticus were very concerned about purity, impurity, and holiness. And we can see that there's been a progression in Judaism from ancient understanding, biblical understanding of holiness, which was separateness, apartness. So, for example, the Kohanim were separated from the rest of the community in the sense that their job was to serve God in the temple. And you had to be born into the Kohanic family to become a Kohen. So you had to have the correct genes, not the denims, but the other types of genes, to become considered a Kohen. And you weren't allowed to own land, you weren't allowed to farm, and you weren't allowed to do other occupations that others did because you were set apart to serve God in the temple. Animals that were sacrificed were set apart. So the person bringing the offering would have to set apart an unblemished animal, a kosher animal, and that animal was only to be sacrificed, couldn't be used for anything else. If you wanted to use that animal for something else, you had to substitute it with another animal so that you could take that animal back and use it to pull a cart or to pull a load, carry a load. If it was a non-kosher animal that was the firstborn, that was meant to give to God, you'd substitute it with a kosher animal. And their time set apart, aside from the rest of life, so to focus on God. And as Judaism progressed after the destruction of the temples, you had a movement away from this idea of apartness to this idea of inclusiveness. So kedusha, holiness, becomes inclusive. And we find that in various rituals. So we are meant to elevate the unholy to the holy, the profane to the holy. Even the most basic act of eating is elevated to become a holy act. And how do you do that? In Judaism, we do it by brachot, by pronouncing blessings over everything that we do. So whether we're eating something, we say a blessing before we eat it, thanking God for that piece of food that we're about to ingest. If it's an act, we say a blessing. If it's a ritual act, we say a blessing. Just as we said a blessing before over the candles, bringing in Shabbat. We say a blessing in the morning before putting on the talit, the prayer shawl in the morning. And so blessings are an important part of Jewish ritual to bring the unholy into the holy, up to the holy. And another ritual that we have, a very, very beautiful ritual, which unfortunately is not really practiced by many people, is the weekly Havdalah ceremony. So Havdalah is a ceremony that we do on Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, after Shabbat is finished, where we say farewell to Shabbat in the hopes that Shabbat will come again a week later. Havdalah ceremony is sometimes translated as separation, but I prefer the translation of distinction. At the moment, we distinguish between holy time and unholy time, but that's only temporary, because one day will come a time where we won't distinguish between unholy and holy. It will all be holy. And that is why the rabbis call the Messianic age a time of holiness, of symbiosis, of peace. Yom Shekolol Shabbat, a time that is always Shabbat. So again, it's about bringing the unholy up to the holy. So when you enter the week, the idea is we say farewell to Shabbat, but we should take the concept of holiness from Shabbat into the week day, into the work week. And we look forward to the next Shabbat, when it will come again. And so we have this tradition of smelling spices at the Havdalah. Why do we smell spices? Because we need to console ourselves that Shabbat is ending, with the hope that Shabbat will come again, that we'll always smell beautiful spices whenever we go out into the world. And it's no coincidence that Havdalah is said at home, because the Jewish home, is a source of holiness. After the destruction of the temples, the rabbis said that we should make our homes into mikdashei ma'at, into small sanctuaries. And so it's in the home that the values that are learned in the Beit Midrash, in the house of study, the values of Torah are inculcated in a practical way. And so the home is a source of our sense of holiness, our sense of purpose, our mission to bring holiness to the world. So when we leave our home, we should take the light of holiness with us. When we enter our home, we should bring holiness with us. And so, although this concept of tameh and tahara, of impurity and purity, is maybe foreign to us. It has an underlying truth which is eternal, the truth of bringing holiness into the world, elevating the world up towards our goal, towards God, and towards our goal of Tikkun Olam Malchut Shaddai, of repairing the world under God's sovereignty. So we can take inspiration, although it's a very dry Torah portion, we can take inspiration from the concepts that are illustrated in our Torah portion. Can you hear that song?